kindergarten classroom teaching engineering design to young students. So I want to give you a little bit of backdrop before Nicole begins. Engineering design is central to the new next generation science standards, which the national and the state science teacher organizations are pushing very hard, because they are standards that are looking at how do we think about critical thinking, engineering design, and getting collaborative work back into the area of science, and moving from inquiry into more of the engineering aspects. Nicole tackled an incredible, difficult assignment. She was asked to develop an engineering design unit following the NGSS standards for kindergarten students, when the teacher had never experienced the standards, when she was learning how to teach engineering design, and she had a student who was completely blind. So she had to work around a lot of the adaptations that were necessary to include one student. So I'm going to turn it over to a woman who is incredibly thoughtful about her students, tenacious about moving forward, and who designed a very stellar unit for this group of very diverse students. So, Nicole?
Hey.
So as Debbie said, my name is Nicole Stevens. I'm a senior. This was a mini unit that I was able to create for my Methods 2 class, which is the second of 3 experiences that student teachers have in actual elementary school classrooms. This particular one, before I get into the details of my lessons, I wanted to talk about what these standards are and what the type of science was that I was teaching. For one thing, when you're teaching science, pretty much when you're teaching anything, it's really important to keep the students engaged. They need to be interested. They need to care. If they don't care, they're not going to learn anything. So the next generation science standards are a way that teaches students to think the way that a scientist thinks, to act the way that a scientist acts. So that way the science means something. They're not doing something just because the teacher told them to. It seems like it has a meaning. And there's 2 different ways that these standards encourage teachers to teach. One of them is using scientific inquiry. This is where students are asking questions, they're investigating, they're manipulating materials, they're figuring out what happens when I do this. And then they play with the materials and they figure out what happens. The main part of this is that the students are teaching themselves a lot. They're figuring things out. It's not just that the teacher tells them the information and then they have to parrot it back. This is where the kids are really getting into the material and they're figuring it out for themselves. Generally, after this, you move on to the engineering design model. In this particular method of teaching, students are solving a problem. They're solving a real-world problem using the content that they have learned. They have to create something, either a product or a process, that will solve this problem. Now these methods are things that are seen in college classrooms, they're seen in high school classrooms, but you don't think about these methods of teaching when you're talking about elementary school students. Especially not when you're talking about kindergarten. You're not asking kindergartners to solve real-world problems, generally speaking. So this was my challenge. I needed to teach kindergarten using these 2 methods. This was the standard that I was given. And basically what this means is students needed to realize that the way that you push or pull on an object affects the direction that it moves and how far it travels. So the first thing that I did was a pre-assessment probe. This is where we need to find out what the students already know. And the way that I did this was I had them explain to me how to move different objects. And what I did was, I started with a ball. It's going to be my guinea pig. All right. So, I need to move this ball to Nathan. Someone needs to tell me how to do it. What do I do with it? I need it to move across the table. So, somebody tell me, roll it.
Roll it in his direction.
Okay. So, I need to move it so that it goes in that direction. All right. So then I would have asked the students to tell me exactly where I needed to put my hand on the ball. So to move it in that direction, they would have to tell me to put it here. Then I would do something like this. And all the students would look at me and I'm like, what did I do wrong? What happened? It didn't work. I did what you told me to do. Why didn't it work? Therefore, they would have to be more specific to tell me I had to push it harder to make it go. Then I did the same basic thing with a block on a string so that they had to tell me how I was going to pull it, that I had to be in front of the block and pull it from this direction in order to get it where it needed to go. They seem to understand the concept because these are pretty sort of things that you almost know instinctually. The harder you push something, the more it's going to move. But what we needed them to be able to do would be to articulate that. They needed to be able to tell me exactly what to do. And that was where things were a little bit tricky. So my first lesson was an inquiry-based lesson, and I put the students in partners, and I handed out a bunch of different objects. And I asked students to talk to their partners and manipulate the materials a little bit and figure out how would be the most effective way to move that object. Is it better to move it by push, by pull, or does it not matter? And then I had them sort them, once they had decided, into a Venn diagram. Now, they did not know what a Venn diagram was, but we didn't talk about that. We just said, if you want to move it by push, put it here, pull, put it here. If it doesn't matter, put it in the middle. So they were using the concept of a Venn diagram even though they didn't know the term. They didn't have any problem with that. That was quite easy for them. And as you can see, the outside of this is lined in pipe cleaners with two different textures. This was for our blind student. These ones are really soft, and these more sparkly ones are rougher in texture, so that she would be able to tell which circle she put her hand on. I also used puffy paint for the letters so that she could feel those, and there's Braille tags because she was learning Braille. She also had a small version of this with her, about the size of a piece of paper that was identical to this with the same textures and everything, so that she could see the big picture before she came to put an object on here, and it allowed her to be able to do the experiment the same as the other students. This is a picture of one of the students who's placing his object. It looks like he's got a yo-yo, and he's telling me that this could move, push or pull, it doesn't matter. I believe that's what he's putting it, or is he putting it? No, I think he's putting it here. We'll find out in a minute. Yeah, he put it on both. So this was our end result. We had blocks on strings for pull. We had these different objects that it didn't matter, and some that really were better to move the push. And this just got students thinking. It got them trying to figure out how do you move objects and what works better. My second lesson went a little bit more in depth. This one, I had this path, and I was asking students to move objects along this path. I had a tennis ball, but this actually would have worked a lot better because the tennis ball turned out to be too big. So the students would take turns. We were sitting in a big circle, and they'd take turns, and they'd have to move it from all along this, and each student would have one section that they would move the ball along. And they had to tell me before they moved it where they needed to put their hands, how hard they needed to push it, what direction they wanted it to move. So we went all the way through the maze with the ball, and then I came back with the block and the string, and we went the other way using pull, doing the same thing. We had a smart board up in the front of the classroom where they were able to draw arrows. I had a copy of this on the smart board, and they were able to draw arrows on there to illustrate what they were doing. And again, I have these foam strips, which allowed my blind student to feel where the path was so that she would also be able to participate. And these rectangles and triangles allowed me to be able to tell her which end of the maze to start on. So she could tell just by the texture of it. And she also had a mini version of that at her seat. Oops. These are some pictures of the students manipulating the objects through the maze. This one was starting with the ball. And then we have a couple who are working with the block and the string. The third lesson was where things got really interesting and a little messy. This was the engineering design model. Now, when you're doing engineering design, you always start with a client. There's a client who's hiring the students to do something, to solve a problem for them. So I told the students that there was a moving company, and they needed to move this block of material that was poisonous to the touch. Could not be touched. And there were two roads that they had to move this block along. One was push road and one was pull road. And those are the only ways you could move an object along those roads. And so they were being hired by this moving company to figure out the best way to move this object. And I explained to them that we were going to be using a model and what that meant, that no, this block was not really toxic. I put a little caution symbol on it for them, but it was not really going to hurt them. I didn't want kindergartners panicking. And then I put them in groups, and I set them up at their tables, and I made little paths on their tables. And I put out a bunch of different materials for them to use, and I just let them experiment for a while. That's where things got messy, because they were very excited about it, and the trick was trying to get them to come to an agreement as a group. That part didn't go as well, but there was a lot of very interesting learning and thinking going on. Then once they had come up with a way to move the objects, I brought them back to the circle, and I showed them this, which was the road. And they had to start here, and they had to move the object to the end of the road using whatever method they had decided was best. And I have some pictures of the students as they're working through this. Here's me explaining it at the beginning and showing them how this was going to work. And this is where they're starting to experiment. They're pushing it with the shovel. Here, I'll show you some of the different tools that I had given them. This time the block did not have the string on it. They had the block that they had to move without touching it. They had a string with a toothpick on one end that when I worked with the kindergartners, I completely covered the toothpick in tape so they weren't stabbing themselves. And a knot at the other end. They had a string with a toothpick but no knot. They had a tiny shovel. They had a ruler, a dowel, and a piece of yarn. And they had to figure out how to do it. They came up with some very interesting and imaginative ways that I would never have thought of to move this block. Some of them started with the shovel because that seems like a pretty obvious one. And then, starting again with the shovel. Thinking about it, just trying to figure out how we want this to go. And this student actually managed to get the toothpick through the hole in the block, and pull it through without touching the block so that he was able to pull the block. This student was sticking the dowel through the hole in the block to be able to push it along that way, which is not something I would necessarily have thought of. I saw them later where they had laid the block flat down and they'd stuck the stick through the hole and they were just pulling it along like this. This is our blind student who was able to participate just as well. You can see here is her small map that has all the foam strips on it. This I found really interesting. This is one that I never would have thought of. She's using a piece of yarn to push the block. I never would have thought of using yarn to push the block. You think of string, you're thinking of pull. But she held it tight between her hands and just pushed it along the path, and it worked perfectly. Another really interesting thing that I learned when I was watching these students as they're experimenting and figuring out how to do this was that we had one student who really struggled academically. It didn't matter what it was, reading, math, all of these things, he had a really hard time with it. When we presented him with this problem, he jumped right in. He was very excited, very enthusiastic about it. He was trying everything under the sun that you could think of. He was using 3 or 4 different tools at a time. They were only supposed to use one, but it was very interesting to see what he did. He used the dowel to push the block onto the shovel, then used the shovel to hold the block up so that he could put the string through it. And I just thought that was very, very interesting that this student who struggled so much was able to do this. While another student who was one of the top students in the class, you could not challenge this student enough. You couldn't stump him. At one point, he's just staring at this, just like, I don't get it. I don't know what to do. He was struggling with, he could push that block all he wanted, but when you wanted him to pull it, he would take the string and put it around, but then he would push it. It's like, no, that's pushing it. And he did manage to do it in the end, but it was much more difficult for him, and that really surprised me. It was very neat to see that sort of difference in the students, where they were showing different strengths that they may not have shown in other situations. When this was done, I did a post-assessment probe. And this was the exact same activity that I started with. The idea was to see what had changed. How would the students react to my questions differently now that these lessons were over than they had at the beginning? And they were able to tell me what I needed to do to move that ball or move that block much easier. They were much more specific. They were much clearer in giving me their directions. So I think that it worked fairly well. Very interesting. And what this showed me was that this method of teaching, this way of getting students to think and act like scientists, is not something that's restricted to older students. It's not something that's restricted to advanced students. It's not something that's restricted to classrooms that don't have students with challenges. Anybody can learn this way. Anybody can benefit from this kind of instruction. And I'm going to give people a chance in a minute to come up and see if they can be more creative than a kindergartner and come up with some ways to move this block. But first I want to see if anybody has any questions.
Actually, I do.
Yes.
So what this is really intriguing, first of all.
Okay.
And I'm particularly interested in the work that you did with the youngster who was blind.
Yes.
And I'm interested in knowing how you identified what you would do to include that student.
I'm not, what do you mean exactly?
How did you think about and come to the conclusion of what you did to the materials so that the student would be able to participate with the others?
I knew it needed to be tactile. It needed to be something that she could feel. So when I had a poster, any line that was on there that the students were going to need to be able to see in order to recognize this needed to be something she could touch. Pipe cleaners and foam strips and things like that and puffy paint, those were all things she was very familiar with that was used in the classroom on a regular basis. So were Braille words. Those were all things that she was very familiar with. So that I incorporated those into my posters so that when she came up, she would be able to feel where these lines were. And I had been concerned that she wouldn't be able to see the whole picture because it's in pieces and because it's so big and you can only touch so much. That's why for each of those posters, I gave her a piece that was just the size of a piece of paper that had the exact same thing, the exact same textures on it. And that made it so that she could look at it and get the whole picture. So when she came to the larger one, she already knew what she was looking at. It was just a bigger piece. She had an aide that sat with her and helped her with her small one to make the connections. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
I want to make a comment. I really like your teaching style. I like that you're using the teach through problem solving approach rather than a show and practice style, such as we commonly have seen probably in our days in school. So using the scientific inquiry, the teach through problem solving approach, I really feel like you get good practice, the way you use the ball, letting them come to the solution rather than giving them the solution beforehand. So I appreciate that, and I like that a lot.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Did any of your students comment on this? Did they say, oh, this is cool doing this, or
Yes,
let's do more?
Yeah, they had a lot of fun with it. They were very, very excited about it. They got very, very into it. In fact, the main problem was that they got too excited about it. Yeah, so it made the management of it a little bit challenging because you have 15 or 16 very excited 5-year-olds. So they wanted to be as close to the materials as they could get and things like that. And my way is the best way to do it, and I don't care if Johnny doesn't agree with me, my way is better. So they were very, very engaged with it.
So you have a job already to teach?
Not yet, I'm currently in my final student teaching semester. So I'm not done yet.
Looking though.
Looking, yes.
Is there something that, having gone through this with this class, you would do differently if you were going to repeat it?
I was going to repeat it
With a different class?
with a different class. For one thing, I probably would have made these a little bit bigger, and I would have used a smaller ball, because they would roll that tennis ball, and they'd hit it, and it would be halfway across the room, and we'd have to get it, no matter how gently they hit it. I probably also would have made some of these, if I could have made them bigger, the lengths longer, so that it was more of a difference between a big push and a small push. The other thing that I would have done would be, if I had my own classroom, I would have worked with the students more, teaching them how to work in a group. That was our biggest challenge. These students were not familiar with how to work in a group and come to a group consensus. So I may have had them work in a group. If it was these students again, I may have had them work in a group, but then give me their individual ideas as to the final product. Because that took a lot of time and had some disagreements between students. Okay, I'm probably running a little short on time. Does anybody feel like being a kindergartner and seeing if they can do this? Have any brave soul who wants to come up here and try it?
Okay.
All right.
And you can't use a way that, sorry.
I can't use a way that was already
gonna
used.
say.
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
You gotta come up with your own way. How creative can you be?
Need some
Alright.
help from the audience.
So he said,
That's
picture
cool. That's cool.
You're on,
You're on push road.
I'm on push road?
You're on push. See?
Uh-oh.
You gotta be pushing.
Right, my bad. Change.
So now you need to figure it. Yeah.
Now I gotta pull.
Yes.
Doing it back.
Is that pulling or
Never
still
paid
pushing?
attention.
Well,
What?
the force
What's
is
the
coming from
definition
the
of-
front the force is coming from the front of this, so that's,
Yay.
Very
all right.
cool.
That's neat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome.